Hello everyone, this is Jason from Shy Snake Games, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we create missions and items and some other assets inside of SpyDNA. So on the screen, this is one of the tools we use called Artiki. It's the tool we use to do all the asset creation for data outside of Unreal. And this is a dialogue tree from one of the missions in the demo. So I'm going to zoom out so you can get an idea of how complex the whole dialogue tree is. Each of these nodes with the picture is a node where someone is talking. You see a couple of these have little symbols next to them. Those are NPCs talking. We just haven't entered all of the NPCs pictures into our tool, so only some of them are showing up here. But if you look, there's also some other nodes here, so that based on your answers, which are these boxes to the left, I'll zoom in a little further so the text is clear. You can see we'll do skill checks. In this case, we can do a check against leadership or charisma or strength. And based on whether they pass or fail and the difficulty set actually in these nodes, then we can modify variables based on that dialogue, based on the result. And those variables can be checked again later in the dialogue tree. So you can be accumulating respect of your NPC, or you can accumulate annoyance in there. And then later they can do things like attack or give you what you want as a result of that. So that gives you an idea of how we do dialogues. This is actually a very helpful tool for us because it makes visualizing these things much easier than if we had to write them out inside of Word or some other tool like that. But I also wanted to talk about how we create items, because one of the questions that came up was if they were going to do some kind of modding for the game, would they be able to create items? So I wanted to give people an idea of, for instance, how we create the items in the game. So most of the information about the functionality of the items is stored in this tool also. So I'm going to click over here on the left. You can see, in this case, it's our different ammunitions that are currently in the game. And adding them is extremely easy, so I'm just going to open one of these up. You can see we just store basic physical information about the ammo, or I'll get to a few other things later. So things like how big is it, how dense is it, how fast does it, with how much velocity does it leave the barrel by default. And you can see a few other fields. So adding extra entries in terms of ammo types is extremely simple. And you see over here it says ammo type pistols. That's actually another field where things like the default penetration and stability, which is how quickly over distance the round loses accuracy, the default accuracy of the round, and you can compare some of these. For instance, compare it to rifle. I guess accuracy should really be renamed precision because lower is better in this case. So that gives you a quick idea of what it's like to add these things. So it's extremely easy for us to add new ammo types or new ammos. And someone else was asking about the actual weapons, and if I keep going down, they're actually pretty straightforward also. So this is a mechanism for it. You can see it can have more than one type of ammo listed if you wanted to support, say, armor penetrating and regular rounds. For weapons that have single shot or full auto, you can set different rates of fire for burst fire or for auto. The reason it says auto and single is if you're firing single shot, max rate of fire is set to the same as if it were auto fire. Very, very, very rarely will that ever come into play because you can't expect the user to pull the trigger faster than automatic. And if it had a burst fire, you would enter the length of how many rounds in that field. So we actually can support lengths other than 3. So that gives you an idea of some of it in Artiki. We can also add skills very easily, and you can see what attributes the skill depends upon. The reason the skills are entered here is we're actually still growing the skill list. This was derived, our system was derived from a tool I'd written for pen and paper games. So we had an extremely long skill list. And what we did is we trimmed that skill list to the minimum we thought we could possibly implement in terms of a game. And as we're writing the story, we're actually adding some of them back. So we didn't want to put a bunch of skills in the game and then try to find uses for them. We're actually going the opposite way of writing the story and then seeing what skills we need. So we're adding them back in as we go. But now I'm going to switch to a different tool. I'm going to go back to Unreal here. So this is one of our weapons in the game. It's the P19 pistol. But the way these hook up to Artiki is in Artiki, you can see, I'm actually going to switch to a different rifle here. The gun itself, in terms of like sight, any other attachments it has like magazine, those are assembled in Unreal for visual effect. And if we wanted to swap out, say, supporting attachments, we could do that because they're actually separate items in the Unreal editor. But up here on the left, let me go back to the actual full thing. You can see it says info item, and it ties back to a gun info. That's this item here. Basically, it's got 3 fields in it. The first thing is just the icon that appears in your inventory. For whatever reason, Unreal doesn't deal well with things with alpha sets. So you can see it in the small image, but the larger image is kind of hard to see. So I'll shrink that down. And then the item ID is just the item ID from the Artiki field. I could show you where that is. But basically, whenever you create an item there, it just gives it a numeric name. And this actor class is this thing here, which if it needs to create one in the 3D world, it spawns this blueprint, and that is what the player will see actually in their game. So in terms of modifying this, we could import new models for these extremely easily, and we can add them extremely easily also, because by far the greatest part of adding these is actually getting the 3D model. That's probably 95% of the work of adding new equipment to the game. So I guess I should also talk a little bit about how we create missions. So I'm going to flip back to Artiki and see if I can find our missions in here. I always forget where I put them, so give me 1 second. So the mission templates currently in Artiki are actually pretty minimal. They mostly just contain the text for the description. We're going to be migrating more of the logic to this place over time. But for right now, a lot of this is still set up inside of Unreal. And let me close this. For instance, this is our base map. I'm going to load one of our other maps here, which is going to be a little weird. Let me find it. It may start playing music. I've realized I didn't go through each of them to turn off the music. So this is actually one of our generated maps. You can see there's nothing in it. If I hit play, it'll take a second and then the map will appear. I probably have it set to one of the large maps based on how long it's taking. It'll get there. Oh yeah, so this is the 1 kilometer large map. So if I pull the camera all the way out, you can see it actually generated a map that is 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. This nav updating, that is something that will go away before the final version of the game. What you're seeing there is Unreal, because we just made the map at runtime, is generating the nav mesh so you can decide where the player can walk. But what we're going to do is in the update that will be shipping very soon to the demo, we switched the pathing code from using the default pathing in Unreal to our own code. We'll also later on be following up by changing the pathfinding to use our own. The reason for that is there's a lot of code here that assumes that the map is made ahead of time in static. But since we generate the maps at runtime, we have a different dependency on the game. I'm going to exit that. The reason there were black bars on the side is just because the aspect ratio was nonsensical. That doesn't happen in the actual game. That's just an editor-only thing. But if I go into maps, I can show you some of what we generate those procedural maps from. So if I go to mission, I'll just pick this one, why not? Basically, there's a number of fields in here, so we have an array of objectives for the player, locations that are supposed to be generated on the map, and then there's required PC, in this case commanders required. There can be additional ones, maximum size of the party, and which uniforms the player is allowed to take on the mission. So these different types of restrictions can be set. And also there's different types of maps. Basically the mission links to a map and links to a set of objects, which are the visual set that you'll see in the maps. In this case, Test 256 is just a 256 meter test map we use for some of our testing. But creating additional generated maps is going to be extremely easy. That's because we've designed it so that a lot of the hard work of generating the map and placing all the items inside it is designed to be procedural. And that will allow us to do two things. One, it makes it a lot easier to add additional missions and for us to create missions on the fly. But the other thing it does is it allows us to get a little more replayability, because even if you play the same mission twice, we can generate the map with a different random seed. And what that means is the map itself is going to be different every single time you play it. So right now we have not turned that on in the demo we shipped because we're still doing some testing, and we thought it was better to provide stability for the moment than to provide infinite replayability in a demo. But before we ship the final game, we'll have plenty of time to work out any glitches that we're seeing with dynamic generation of maps. So the replayability will go up greatly at that point. So I'll actually go through a couple other things on the maps. We can do desert foliage. So when we're adding different maps, this is just the set of types of shrubs and things you will see on the map. So swapping out visual candy is extremely easy. For this one we have just one of each on the screen, so that's why you're seeing them on top of each other. I can move them here, make it a little easier to see. Just by default they appear right in the center when we added them. This doesn't actually appear in the map because these will be removed before they're actually placed. So that gives you a quick idea of what it's like to add additional missions and how much work it'll be for us. So it'll actually be quite rapid. One of the other things that was asked is how far along are we on the GUI in terms of the user interface? So I'm going to close that out and we'll relaunch this so you can actually, I'll go back to a different map here first. Oop, wrong one. Now I'm going to hide the navigation mesh because it's just very distracting. So this is back to our home base, which starts up a lot quicker than generated maps for the point of demonstration. But the UI, we're actually pretty close to final in terms of the layout and the functionality. There's a few things that we've done. So for instance, wrong key. So that was me using one of the shortcuts that works in the actual game but doesn't apparently work in the editor, because we have a shortcut to actually slide the HUD over and hide the body cam. One of the questions that came up was minimum spec requirement. And so this little camera, while it's very helpful, actually does consume a fairly large amount of performance. So we now have a control tab. We'll let you slide the HUD to the right and hide that, and that'll recoup some of the performance if you're on a performance-constrained system. But one of the other questions that came up is, how close are we to final? So in terms of the layout of the GUI, I think we're actually fairly close. We'll probably be revisiting some of the stylish items at some point. In some places they're just not there yet. So for instance, the status screen, this is going to be overhauled before too long, because we're going to replace this 2D image on the left with the actual 3D model of the character. That'll also resolve some of the placements where the shots aren't ending up exactly where they should, because we'll be using the same model as you see in the game at that point. One of the other things in the inventory, we're actually going to put a 3D image of the item that you're clicking on for the cases where they're fairly well rendered in game. So for like the different weapons or the different armors, you'll be able to see them before we ship. So in terms of screens like this where it's just a display of data, I think we're actually pretty close to final. These icons are not. Alex has not had time to redo them yet, but they will get cleaned up before the final one ships. There's also a few places where we're just going to be changing the GUI in order to implement functionality that isn't there yet. So for instance, when I go to the equipment screen, or the inventory screen, I mean, we're going to have to provide functionality for moving items from one character to another. Right now that functionality isn't there. You can drop items. So for instance, if I wanted to drop, let's say this grenade, you can drop it on the hand and that'll remove it from your inventory. But there's still a lot of work to be done on some of these items. But we will get there. And so for minimum specification, we've tested on Intel integrated. So we actually have a Sandy Bridge laptop that we use from testing for time to time. Effectively, that's going to be the bare minimum in terms of performance. Right now, we're we load the GPU more than the CPU. So graphics performance is really currently the bottleneck in most of the maps. The exception to that will be when you're actually going from map to map. That's still CPU bound at the moment, so high-end systems will do that faster. One of the other reasons we wanted to redo the navigation code is I really want to make it multi-threaded, because there's no reason for the majority of the CPU cores to be sitting idle while one is making your nav mesh and have the player waiting the whole time. So we think we can speed that up greatly from what it's doing right now through a handful of optimizations. So I think that's everything I was going to cover in this video. As always, keep sending us your questions and I'll try to answer them in the future. But thanks for your time, and look for us on Greenlight, and give the demo a try if you have not done so yet.